So we're going to break this down into the regular Phoenix side and then the LiveView side because it's a little bit different. Now, in order to follow along, you're going to have to open up the documentation. So I've got hexdocs.pm/Phoenix open here, and we're going to be reading the latest version, which is 1.7.11, but it's going to be pretty similar on other versions of Phoenix. And we're going to be looking at a couple different pages so you can follow along. We're going to be looking at the guide section, this routing page here. Then there's a couple other guides that are kind of important. There's this request lifecycle guide. Now, one thing I need to point out is the LiveView documentation is actually in its own hexdocs page. So you do need to come here to Phoenix LiveView's documentation once we get to the LiveView section. And also Plug has its own package, so it has its own documentation too. So you will need to reference some of the stuff in here as we go along. Let's dig right into it by going to the guide section and going to the router page. We're basically going to go through this together, and I'm going to do my best to explain some of this. And it's important to know where these pages are in the docs, so once this video is done, you know how to continue learning, you know where to go to reference this information in the future. But I'm going to do my best to summarize it for you. So get comfortable, get a snack, get a drink, whatever you want, and let's learn Phoenix routing together. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is when we're looking at the router, you see how there's all these like calls here, pipeline and plug, that do not have parentheses around them. This is a telltale sign that we are dealing with macros. And if you don't know, the gist of it is that macros are a compile time feature of a number of programming languages, including Elixir, that lets you define code that's going to run strictly at compile time. Macros in all programming languages have a reputation for being potentially very confusing, but very powerful. So you can do a lot with them. They can be kind of dangerous. You can write confusing code with them because they can do so much. And the docs actually have a little section down here that mentions the fact that the router uses more macros than most of the Phoenix project. And it points out that the main reason they are used is for compile time safety and compile time speed. They can optimize all of these matches to one giant case statement that'll be heavily optimized, so the whole thing will run a lot faster. But it can be confusing to know where to look for stuff in here. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this line here, use hello web. Now we're going to be looking at another project of mine, and this project is an RSS reader, and the specifics of it aren't really important, but I have the router for this project open over here. The website is called Catnip RSS, and so the module name is called CatWeb, so that's what we're going to be looking at today. So I've got my router open for this project, and I have a lot of stuff in here that we may or may not talk about, but it's pretty similar to what comes out of the box in a new project. Now this section here, use CatWeb router, this has a module that we can go look at. It is in the web directory. It is at the top level of the lib directory, and it's going to be right here. It's going to have your project _web. So if we go look at that, there is a router block here, and we can make a pretty good guess that this is what is being loaded here. But if you're interested in how this works specifically, I think when people are learning, it isn't immediately obvious to them how this whole file works here. But how this works is there's a using macro at the bottom of this file here, which corresponds to these use calls, which is itself a macro. And when this gets called, this argument here is going to be passed to which, and that's going to be passed to apply, which is a dynamic function call function, and it's going to look up the function with that name, which in this case is router. So this is how it results in the calling of this router function here, and then all of this stuff is going to get imported. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that in reality because this is a macro, so it's inside of like a quote block, so the whole thing is going to be like executed as if it was in here, but the specifics of that are not important. This is not a Elixir macro tutorial. I just want you to understand where this is. Everything you see in the router here, all these functions, all these macros, are going to come from one of four places. Either this use Phoenix router line, which we'll look at in a second, or one of these three imports, plugcon, Phoenix controller, LiveView router. Now, just like this use macro has a corresponding using block at the bottom of the file here, we can also take a look at Phoenix router, and I have on my keyboard GD in Vim mapped to go to definition using the Elixir LSP. So if you use Vim, you can configure something similar, or if you use VS Code, I'm sure you have a similar key binding. But whatever you use to jump into this file, you can take a look at the Phoenix router with me. And if we scroll down to this using block, this is exactly what's going to get run when we call use Phoenix router, which is basically going to run a whole bunch of imports itself. So it's going to run this prelude function, which imports a bunch of stuff. This is kind of a common thing you'll see on a number of using macros in the Phoenix project, where they import inside the using block the module itself. Interesting that it also imports plugcon and Phoenix controller, since these come from a new project, but I guess that's going to be deprecated soon. But yeah, everything in here, one of these three macros here, is what is going to get imported when use Phoenix router is called. So these four things are where everything in the router comes from. Now, one other thing I want to draw your attention to is here in the web module, when we call use Phoenix router, you may or may not have this helpers false line here. This corresponds to an old way of referencing paths. Before Phoenix 1.7, this was the way you would go about referencing paths in your app, and I believe this syntax kind of comes from Rails. Rails had a similar helper method structure for this sort of thing. But in 1.7, they added a new way of doing this, and so when you set helpers false, it turns off the old way. And the new way of doing things, if we go back to the routing guide, is called verified routes. So instead of having those helper functions, we can actually write these little statements here that you've probably seen in the docs. This is a sigil. This one's called sigil P, and then there's a path inside of this string here. And the cool thing about this is, because the router is a big compile time plug macro, it actually knows which routes are valid and which ones are not. So if you use this syntax and you reference a route that doesn't exist, as they kind of show here, it'll actually tell you that that route doesn't exist. So by setting helpers false and using these instead, you get an extra layer of compile time safety everywhere in the app that you reference these paths, which is not something that I've seen another web framework do, which I think is pretty cool. So that's verified routes. I just want to touch upon that because it shows up quite early if you are reading through the router itself. If we go back to the top of the routing guide and scroll down, the first thing we really get to is the router definitions themselves. Now, they should be pretty familiar to you if you're used to most other web frameworks. They have a HTTP verb, a path, a controller, and an action. This sort of thing is common. You should be pretty used to it. And another thing that Phoenix, I believe, took from Rails is this resources macro. If you are using RESTful routes, which I do not have a whole lot of in the app that we were just looking at, but if you are really into using RESTful routes, you can use this resources block, and it will define a whole bunch of routes for you. So you see this resources call here is going to define all these RESTful routes: users index, users edit, users new, users show, all that with one line. So if you are using RESTful routes, that may be useful to you. And if we scroll down, it also mentions somewhere in here, down here I believe, that you can nest these resources if you have need of nested RESTful routes for some reason. And I will just say that if you want to use RESTful routes, you know that you're going to want to do it. So, feel free to use this shortcut if you want. But if you are learning Phoenix and if you find the router confusing or anything, just know that you don't have to use this if you don't want to. You can just reference everything directly as you see here. So that's resources. It's pretty easy to understand. It's just a shortening for defining RESTful routes. Now, if we scroll down, the next thing we're going to come to in the docs is scoped routes. And here is where we need to pause and talk about Plug. Now, Plug is an HTTP middleware library. If you come from like Rails, Rails has its own middleware called Rack. If the concept is totally new to you, it's basically a library that handles the underlying call and response, or the request and the response. In Rails, it actually does have dedicated request and response objects, but Plug works a little bit differently. It actually has one object called the con, and that con is shared between the request and the response. So if you're totally new to Phoenix, that's how it works under the hood. It uses Plug, its HTTP middleware, to handle routing and a whole bunch of other stuff. And actually, the interesting thing is the router itself is just one big plug, and we will get to that in a moment. Now, I mentioned that Plug has its own documentation. If you need to reference it, it is here. Just be aware. The Phoenix docs do talk about Plug quite a bit, but there is a little bit of extra information there. And there's also this guides page. Now, when we take a look at the definition of plugs, there's basically two different ways you can do them. There's these inline function plugs, which are, as the name explains, just a function. All plugs take the con object and a set of options. So that's what they're going to look like. But the more common thing you will see more often are these module plugs. These make it a little bit easier to set the options like this, and they will just be in a module that imports plug con, and they will have a call function that also takes the con, and it will always do something to the con, whatever that plug may be doing. Now let's look at some of the plugs that come in a new Phoenix project. Everything you see here is going to be in a new Phoenix project, or it's going to be the result of running Mix Phoenix Gen Auth, the authentication system built into Phoenix. By looking at these, you can kind of understand what they do, and it should be pretty familiar to you. They all handle little units of stuff that we need to do on the connection, setting acceptable MIME types, checking the CSRF token. They are literally pluggable pieces that we can, put in or out to do stuff to the connection. One plug that you will have if you've run the Phoenix Gen Auth generator is this last one here, fetch current user. Now, if we grep for that in our project, we will see that it is here in user auth, and this is a file that'll come from the generator, from the Mix Phoenix Auth generator. And I think looking at this plug really gives you a good idea of what you will often end up doing with your own plugs. It'll often be stuff like this, getting the current user out of a session token in a cookie, or doing stuff like that, and then assigning them to the con. So this is actually a particularly important one because this plug is how the current user gets assigned across the whole app. So if we were to look at any controllers that access current user, this is how they're able to access it. When we look at the router, we see that there are these pipeline definitions, and what they allow us to do is define a common set of plugs that are going to be executed all at once when we reference this pipeline later on. So for instance, if we go down here to one of our scopes, we can see an instance of piping through the set of browser plugs. Everything in this block, in this scope block, from sitemap down to this LiveView thing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is all going to run through this browser pipeline. Everything in this pipeline, each plug is going to run from top to bottom, and they're going to run on the requests. These plugs are going to run on the requests. Now, it's important to note that this pipe through macro can take both a pipeline or plugs directly. So if we look at this example down here in my project, this is a pipe through where we are passing the name of a pipeline, but also the name of a plug directly. So this is going to run the auth pipeline that I've defined here. Each one of these is going to run. And then redirect if user authenticated is itself a plug that's going to be added on to the end of this pipeline. And that's an interesting one to look at because it kind of answers the question that I get a lot, which is how do I go about adding authorization rules to my app? That's what everyone wants to do. They start a new Phoenix project to learn. They run the generator, and then they want to figure out how do I make parts of my app for certain users? How do I check the roles of my users? How do I do all that stuff? And it's going to get a little bit more complicated when we start to talk about LiveView, but just talking about plugs, the answer is pretty simple. You're going to do it in the plugs. So if you have no LiveView, that's all you need to think about. You can write plugs like this. Redirect if user is authenticated is one that comes from the generator, and it checks current user, checks to see if current user is set. That means that they were logged in successfully. There was a session in their cookies that the plug higher up was able to get them from. And if they are set, this plug is actually going to redirect them. Require authenticated user is probably a little bit more sensible. example, because this redirect of user is authenticated, is used to protect all these routes that we don't want people to hit if they are logged in. But there's also routes that we want people to hit only if they're logged in. For instance, if we go down here, this pricing page, I only want people to see if they are logged in, so I use require authenticated user. And if we look at that, it's right down here. So you can kind of see an example of what you can do in these plugs. We're checking current user, checking if they're confirmed. So this first block is basically, are they logged in and are they confirmed? If so, just return the con. Don't do anything. It's fine. Accept the connection. But if one of these things are not true, for instance, if they are not confirmed, we can throw up an error and say, you have to confirm your email. Or if they're not logged in or not confirmed, we send them to the login page. So that's the kind of things that you can do in your plugs to handle authorization. Okay, now I just kind of glossed over scopes, so I want to come back to talk about that a little bit. If we go to the routing docs and we go down to where we were talking about scopes. So we kind of touched on what plugs and pipelines are, these sets of functionality that operate on the con. Scopes interact with those in a way that lets us define a common namespace for our routes and for our pipelines or our plugs. So when we define a scope and we give it this name, that's going to be prefixed on all of the routes inside the scope. So in this example, when we have /admin, all these here are going to get prefixed with /admin. And then the other important thing about scopes is they can receive a module name like this. And when we reference modules inside of here on our routes, that will get prefixed in front of the module. So that's another thing that I think kind of trips people up when they're learning Phoenix. They look at these routes that come from the generator and they're like, how am I able to call these even though I haven't imported them or aliased them? Well, it's because in the scopes, this cat web module is getting imported, or everything in there is getting imported, and then they can access those module names unqualified. So that's how scopes work, basically. There's nothing magical about them. They're just a way to combine a route prefix and a module prefix, and then they allow you to define some plugs for your routes. Now, if you have run the Phoenix GenAuth generator and you're kind of confused how it all fits together, you can check this page in the docs, this Mix Phoenix GenAuth page down here, and this does tell you a little bit about behind the scenes how it all fits together. It's not really router specific, but I think it is important for you to read through because it talks a little bit about some of the plugs that come out of the box. Now, the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the basics of Phoenix routing is the endpoint. Now, everything you've seen here is not actually the entry point into our application. That is a whole other file called the endpoint, and if we go to our web directory, it's going to be right next to the router. It's going to be called endpoint.ex, and this is where all the HTTP calls actually enter our Phoenix app. This is sitting a layer above the router, and actually behind the scenes, this is kind of the connection point between our router and all our other plugs and the underlying HTTP server. Now, under the hood, for most of the history of the Phoenix project, it has used Cowboy as its HTTP server, and Cowboy is written in Erlang. It's been around for quite a while, but just recently, there's actually been a change, and now the default is Bandit by Matt Trudell, which is entirely written in Elixir. I don't think there is a Erlang component to it. It does use another library written by Matt Trudell called Thousand Island, which itself is kind of a version of a library that Cowboy uses called Ranch. So in the case of Cowboy, Ranch is the TCP protocol library, and in the case of Bandit, that is Thousand Island. So Thousand Island does all the TCP handling stuff. But Bandit is the new underlying HTTP server, and you can read all about it if you want. It looks really cool. It's very new that it's been the default. It hasn't been for super long, so there's not a whole lot I can really tell you about it from the practical side of things, but it seems like it's ready for prime time. So if you have an existing project with Cowboy, you can switch over to it, or if you start a new Phoenix project, you can experiment with it there. So under the hood, the endpoint is connecting our plugs and our routes and everything to Cowboy, or Bandit, whichever one you use. Just like the router, there is a whole bunch of plug definitions in here, and there's also a couple of other things like this socket definition here. This is a special thing that's making LiveView itself work, but most of what's in here is plugs. And another interesting thing is way at the bottom here, there's a plug call that points to our router. So like I said, the router is itself just another plug. So that's kind of a cool little detail. It's a good tip to know if you're ever in an Elixir interview, I guess. Might be a trivia question that you get. One of the interesting questions that comes up sometimes is how do you decide what plugs to put in the router versus the endpoint? So if we're looking at the endpoint, we can have plugs in our pipelines that we call in our scopes, but how do we decide to do them there versus in the endpoint if we can also do them in the endpoint? And basically the answer to that question is, do you need to run this thing before the routing match happens in the router? For instance, when we're looking at the static plug here, this is responsible for serving files from the disk, serving static assets, and we want that to happen before routing happens because those paths they have nothing to do with the router. So there's no need to go through all the routing matching and then serve static assets. By pulling them out of the router, we're going to serve those assets faster. Same thing with the live socket. It has nothing to do with the router, so it can be in the endpoint. And then there's also things that we want to happen in every request, like error handling is going to happen up here. One last thing about routing and plugs before we move on. I have an example here of doing plugs dependent on environment. So you see this one is checking if a certain environment variable is set, and it's enabling certain plugs. I have another example of this here in the router. If I go down here, I have this /mailbox route, and I think this comes out of the box, so you should have this same thing too. I don't remember off the top of my head if yours out of the box is also gated behind this sort of thing, but this is how you can gate certain routes behind only certain environments. So this just evaluates to true if the environment is dev. So if we look up that dev routes thing here in dev.exs, it's just getting set to true in dev. So this will evaluate to true, and then everything in here will be true only in dev. Now, because these things happen at compile time and not runtime, that's why you have to do it here with compile end. So there's another function in application that lets you check environment variables or config settings and stuff not at compile time, and that will not work because everything in the router has to be evaluated at compile time, not at runtime. So if you want to gate something behind a certain environment, you have to use compile end. What that also means is that there is no such thing as just dynamic routing. You can't come up with a way to like match on a certain path and then like switch it up and have it route somewhere else. It doesn't work like that. The router is entirely compiled. You cannot add dynamic stuff to it. You can have a route matched and then redirect to somewhere else, but you can't do weird dynamic shenanigans. The one exception to that with dynamic shenanigans would be using something like this. There's a plug called Unplug that does kind of let you short circuit because it's outside of the router. So here, when you're up in the endpoint, you can do stuff that you can't do in the router because you're outside of the router. So you can kind of do whatever you want. So if you need to do weird stuff like enabling certain plugs only if this thing is true at runtime or not, you can look into this unplug thing to do that. But that's all there is to say about the router and endpoint. Pretty much. The only thing I didn't really touch on is this socket thing here, but it just handles connections to the WebSocket that makes LiveView work, and there's a similar one down here for code reloading. We don't need to dig into the specifics of how that works, just know that they are here. If you are interested, you can come up to this use Phoenix endpoint block, and we can jump to definition on that, and here you can see all the macros that make the endpoint tick. So there's a whole bunch of stuff here. Like this is the definition of the plug macro itself. So this is how all those plugs get defined. And there's the actual start link behind the scenes. So everything in here is going to run in your supervision tree. So actually, yeah, if we wanted to dig even further, if we open the application file, this is what makes the actual endpoint function behind the scenes. So because there is a child spec and a start link definition in here in Endpoint, which is used in your endpoint, that all ends up allowing us to start the endpoint as a child application up in our application.ex file. So that's what's actually getting started, and then Cowboy or Bandit is accepting the connections and passing them to the endpoint. That's from top to bottom how it works. So that was a lot of info about the essentials of the router. We talked about plug, we talked about pipelines, we talked about scopes, we talked about how the endpoint works and how all this routing actually happens behind the scenes. That's our router essentials. And now we can talk about LiveView, my favorite part of the video. So the LiveView routing is similar to what we looked at, but also different in some very key ways. Before I dig into the router, the LiveView router, I want to give you a quick overview of the LiveView page lifecycle, just in case you don't know. It's not the purpose of this video, but if you don't know, the way LiveViews mount to the page is they have a full page, a full HTTP call that's going to go through all our plugs and everything like that. And then once we send that page to the user, it's going to have a JavaScript file that's going to load, and we can look at that file actually. Here's my app.js file, and it's really ugly. I got a whole bunch of stuff in here that you are not going to have, because you're going to have a really nice project that doesn't have all this commented out stuff. Here in your app.js or app.ts file, you're going to have this live socket line, and this is going to connect, and it's going to try to connect to that /live route, which itself is here in the endpoint. When we're looking at this is what's going to connect to the socket to mount our live views. So once that JavaScript runs, it's going to connect here, and it's going to send the current page back to the router again, or back to the endpoint again, and that's when LiveView is going to take over. So then it's going to do all of the mounting again. It's all going to happen twice. So if we look at an example LiveView in my project here, you will almost always see a mount and a handle params callback. Sometimes maybe one or the other, but you will generally see both. And what will happen is this mount and this handle params is going to fire on both sides of those interactions. So it's going to happen once when the HTTP call happens, and then it's going to happen again when the socket mounts. So that's one thing to remember. I think this is kind of named not very well, because the name mount kind of makes you assume that this happens only in the connected state once the socket is mounted. But that's not true. It happens twice. And you can actually differentiate between the two by checking if the socket is connected or not. So this is a pattern you will see quite often if you want to do something only in the connected state. For instance, attaching to pub/sub channels, you can do that here by checking if the socket is connected or not. Now, last bit of underlying information I think you need to know before we can continue is you need to understand a little bit about live navigation, because it's important to the router. There are 3 different ways of navigating in a LiveView app. You've got regular links with href, and this is a component that does a little bit of extra stuff behind the scenes, but it has these 3 properties. So you have href, which is going to be just like a regular anchor tag, or it also corresponds to the redirect function. Then you have navigate, and also the push navigate function, which you will have access to in LiveViews. And this is where the real magic happens in LiveView. Instead of a full page reload, this is going to change the page in place. Going to load the new live view, and it's going to inject it into the page, and everything is going to get diffed, and it's going to change without a full page reload. So it's going to behave like a SPA, like a single page app in JavaScript. So the navigations are going to feel very snappy. Finally, there's patch, which is a lot like navigate, but it's only for going to the same live view. Although one important thing to note when we're talking about the callbacks lifecycle of LiveView is that handle params is the only callback that gets fired on a patch. Mount does not get fired on a patch. The other 2 options will fire both handle params and mount. So that's your background on how LiveView works, if you didn't know already. If we look up the live macro here under Phoenix LiveView router. This is getting imported if we go back to our router definition and then we take a look at that web file. This is what's getting imported when we import Phoenix LiveView router, and it gives us access to these macros here, live and live session, and I think there's a couple other things too, but those are the two main ones. Now, live session is a lot like scopes. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. But live is the main one to understand, and it's how we mount our live views in the router. The documentation is here. As it points out, live macros also correspond to GET requests in the router. That is because each live view lifecycle starts its life as a regular GET request. So it's always a regular GET request. We return HTTP, and then the socket takes over. So every time we have a live definition, we also have a GET request. Just because you have a live definition going to somewhere doesn't mean you can't also have another HTTP router call going to that same place. So in this instance, I've got some posts that I'm doing here. So I can post to feed controller, and they are feeds. Subscribe is the route, but they could just as easily be /feeds. So if you want to have a live view mounted at /feeds, but you also want to be able to post requests to /feeds, this is how you would do it. You would have a controller and you would have a live view. So if you want to just handle GET requests, and there's something that you can do by looking at the params, then you can get by with just live views. But as soon as you need post requests or things like that, you're going to need to bring controllers into the mix as well. Now, something to point out here is this last attribute here, this last parameter here. This looks a lot like a controller action, but it's not. It's called a live action, and they are talked about here in the docs. And basically what they are is a way to have one live view that points to multiple pages, or that kind of represents multiple pages. There is this example of /articles that all point to article live index, but they have different live actions to represent like a new form or an edit form or a list of articles. So you could do this and have everything point at one live view, but check the status of this live action signs and then render different things based on whether it's new or edit or index. What I want you to know, however, is that you don't actually have to use that if you don't want to. You can totally just remove it if you have a live view that doesn't use it, and this one that I have here, in fact, doesn't use it, so I could leave it like that if I wanted to. So that's the first thing to remember, in my opinion, is that you don't need to use the live actions if you don't want to. And in fact, I think you're probably better off not using them to start and just have multiple live views. You know, that's how I would recommend you get started before trying to have one live view that does a whole bunch of stuff and has a bunch of live actions. Of course, if you have a reason to do that, don't be afraid of doing that. But if you are just getting started, don't be afraid to just not use the live actions. Now, live session has its own section in the docs. In essence, it's quite similar to a scope because we can use these on mount sections kind of like we can use pipelines in scopes. And we can nest them, we can put live view routes in live session, and we can also put regular routes in them, like this right here. But we don't need to have our live view routes in live session. We could totally just have them here at the top of another scope, and that would be just fine. But if you want to take advantage of the ability to have these on-mount calls, you may want to be using a live session. Now, these on-mount calls are quite similar to plugs, as I said. If we come to the documentation here and we look up on-mount, and remember I am in the LiveView docs here, so it is a separate page. But if we read the docs for on-mount, we can see that a lot like a plug, they fire on the initialization of the page, and they let us do the same things we can kind of do in a plug. So if we look at this one, ensure authenticated, we looked at a plug that was very similar to this. So now we can look at the LiveView version, and it looks very much the same, except instead of taking a con, the plug con, it's going to take the socket, the LiveView socket, but it's going to do the same sorts of things. It's going to check if the current user is set, and if they are, it's going to continue and accept the connection, and if they are not set, it's going to halt the connection and return the socket. So to circle around to what we were talking about with how do I structure authorization in my app? How do I know where to put my authorization logic? that sort of thing. That's the answer, is it needs to be in both places. You need to have on mount hooks if you want to use LiveView, and you also need to have plugs. The reason you need to have both is because of the live navigation features that I talked about earlier. So when we do live navigations, which are like using that link component with the navigate property, when we do that and we go to a new live view, it's going to mount without doing a full page reload. So that means that the second live view that mounts is never going to run through the plugs. Because it doesn't run through the plugs, everything that we rely on in the plugs for authorization is not going to fire the second time. So that's why you need to have your authorization logic on both sides. Because if you're ever going to be able to live navigate to that page, if you don't put your logic in your on mounts as well, then we'd be looking at old data from the very first HTTP call that they made. They might live navigate between 10 different pages, but only that first page they hit is ever going to go through the plugs. And then all the subsequent ones are just going to be live navigations that just go through mount and the on mounts and everything like that. There is a really good page in the docs on here in the guide section called security considerations. And it's kind of a long document, not super long, but I would really recommend you read through this in its entirety after the video. But it goes through what I'm talking about here. And one of the most important things to note about live session is live session can be used to draw hard boundaries between parts of the app. For instance, if we do have some kind of logic for authorization that happens in our plugs, say we have some kind of authorization thing for admin users, like this here, HTTP auth admin. If we have that and we have people doing live navigations from different parts of the app, what we could do is when we have live sessions that define two different sections of the app, when users try to use live navigate to go from point A to point B across a live session boundary, it's actually going to force them to do a full page reload. So that's the thing that's kind of confusing to people, because you do need to kind of think through how to do authorization on both sides, but also you have this tool in your repertoire if you need it. You can use live session to force calling the plugs again. And of course, if the user is going to a dead view or regular page, then the plugs are going to fire again. This is only for talking about going from live view to live view. And again, worth pointing out, when you do a navigation to the same live view using patch, that results in only handle params firing, not mount. Another thing to point out about live navigation and the live routes and everything is the way they interact with live layouts. So since Phoenix 1.7, there is a 2 layout system. Every new app you make is going to have an app layout file and a root layout file. And the root layout file is only going to be rendered on the first page loads, any page loads that do HTTP calls, basically. But subsequent live navigations, they will re-render the app layout. So on the first call to a live view, both root and app are both going to render, and on subsequent calls that use live navigation, only app layout is going to re-render. So if you have some piece of information that you need to change from your live views, say you track the currently signed in user in the nav bar or something like that, that's the kind of thing that you would need to put in the app layout, not in the root layout, because live navigations will not respect the changes unless they're in the app layout. The page title is a special thing that gets to break that rule, kind of. I mean, it has its own special way of working, but you can read about that in the docs. One last thing I want to point out is there is another way to mount live views that doesn't use the router, and it's called live render. I want you to just put that out of your brain and forget that it exists, because for most situations, you should never really need it. If you're building a new app, just don't use it, okay? LiveView doesn't really love having multiple live views on the same page, and live render allows you to do that. Because it's not mounted in the router, you can just use this in another template, and you can render nested live views or have multiple live views on the page. You can do all that. I don't recommend you do. I don't think it works very well. And also when you look at all of these functions that let you mount live views and stuff, they often have this container here that you can kind of define as like a DOM element that wraps around them. When we look at live session, it's got some similar kind of settings where it can set also different layouts and stuff like that. Oh, and one last thing about live session and on mount. When we look in the docs about on mount, we see that we can use it directly from our live views. Like this, we can just call on mount in a live view. That would be at the top level. But when we were looking at live session has its own fancy special way of adding on mounts. So we can specify them in here, and then they apply to all the live views as if we had put them in there. So just wanted to point that out, that there's actually two ways to define them. So it doesn't necessarily matter where you do it. You can do it one or the other. But this is how you would handle authorization in your live views, and the plugs is how you would handle it everywhere else. But you have to do it on both sides for everything to really work properly. And it's really easy to extend what Phoenix GenAuth gives you, the generators. If we were to look at one of these plugs, like require authenticated user, we could kind of very easily see how we would write a new plug to do some kind of other authorization thing we want to do. Like say we want to check only admin users are allowed to access these routes. Well, we could really easily do that by making a new plug called require admin user, and it would take the con and a set of options, and then we could get the current user from the con, because again, remember, pipelines happen in order, plug calls happen in order. So when we have fetch current user here, that's going to put current user on the con, and then all our subsequent calls to subsequent plugs are going to have access to it. So as long as fetch current user is above the plug that we are going to be writing, we will have access to current user. And then we can check if current user.admin is true, then we'll return the con. And if not, we'll say you need to be an admin, and then we can, send them to admin/login or whatever. So that's all we would have to do to write a plug to check if admin is true on a user, for instance, assuming that you've had a migration that adds this field and everything like that. And interestingly, you saw for a second there, it told us that this route doesn't exist. That's the verified routes feature kicking in. And if we want to use that, we could come down here and we could change this pipe through to a list, and we could add require admin user. So there is our new plug right there. And then we can just as easily add a new server mount or new on mount hook to our live views to do the same thing. We could do something like this. So we'll copy and paste from the other one, and we can check current user admin, and if they are admin, we will continue. And if they are not admin, we can do something like this, send them to login. We'll just change this to require admin user. So we could easily write new authorization logic like that, and then using it would be a simple matter of coming to somewhere like this and changing this to require admin, or whatever we called it. Yeah, require admin user. So boom, that's all we got to do. We could change this to require admin user. So in our live session on mount hooks, we would reference require admin user. And in our plugs, we would need to reference the name of the plug, which we called also require admin user. So as long as we do that, then boom, we've kind of done our authorization. That's kind of all there is to it. All right, I know this was a big topic. We covered a lot. We talked about a lot. I just wanted to give you an overview of how all the pieces fit together. I showed you some of the practical side of things. How do you actually use plugs and on mounts to make new authorization rules? That is important, but it's also important to know, how do all these things fit together? How do my requests go from point A to point B? How does the endpoint work? How do plugs and scopes and pipelines work? All that sort of thing. We covered a lot of ground, so don't be discouraged if it doesn't all make sense at first. This is a lot of information. The more you work with this, the more it is going to make sense though. and having this grounding in the fundamentals. When you go into your app and you start tinkering with things, things are really going to start to click. But thank you very much for tuning in. If you have any other suggestions for Phoenix videos, I would really appreciate them. Or leave any comment you want, really. Leave some kind feedback in the comments. Also, of course, if you liked the video, I would appreciate if you clicked the like button. That seems like a fair trade. And if you really liked the video, it'd be nice if you hit the subscribe button. That's all I ask. If you liked it, like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, then don't. That's it. Either way, leave me a comment. Let me know which one you decided. And that's about it. I hope you had fun today, and good luck in your Phoenix journey. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.